For many nations around the world, global trade is truly essential to their security and economic prosperity. There are nations that rely on international imports for things as basic as energy supplies and food, while many have also built their economic models around the export of much-needed goods or commodities. But for those models to work, billions of tons of cargo has to be shipped around the world every single year. And so when the Houthis in Yemen began escalating attacks against ships on the busy trade lanes of the Red Sea, the effects quickly began to resonate along the global supply chain. And major powers, including the United States, began to deploy assets to the region to keep trade flowing. Now the crisis has seemingly escalated to a new, more lethal phase. It's been reported that Houthi forces in the Red Sea fired on an American Navy helicopter, which responded with lethal force in turn. An Indian official has said the country would fine those responsible for a recent attack off the Indian coast. And the British Defence Secretary has said the nation is now considering airstrikes on the Houthis after the recent attacks. The stakes for the region and global economy are arguably very high, at the same time as these attacks have already been seen to raise an uncomfortable question. In an era of increasingly affordable precision weapons like drones and anti-ship missiles, how can nations realistically protect the global trade flows on which they have become so reliant? To explore that question, I'm going to split this video up into a couple of sections. First, we're going to set the scene looking at the importance of global maritime trade flows and the Red Sea region specifically. Then we're going to talk about the recent attacks in the Red and Arabian Sea and their impact on global trade. Note, however, that this isn't a video where I'll be going into detail on the history of the Houthis or the Yemeni civil war. After talking about the attacks, I'll look at the military response of countries like the United States and the costs and challenges of convoying or the trade protection mission. And then finally, in the second half of the video, I want to zoom out further, talking not just about some of the broader economic implications, but also about what this might signal for future risks to global trade, including an understanding of just how reliant the world is on certain key maritime choke points, and the significant and growing challenge that relatively affordable weapons pose to those vital arteries of global trade activity. Okay, so to start with, we probably need to set the scene a little. That means looking at global maritime trade flows, their importance, and why one small disruption in one place on the planet might be a serious concern to people living in a country half a world away. To put it simply, most economies around the world are now highly reliant on access to international markets for everything from basics, thinking for example of the long list of countries that are not energy independent, through the types of luxuries and consumer goods that many economies have come to expect. The Scandinavian winter, for example, might make for some amazing December photography and excellent skiing opportunities, but good luck growing a coffee plant there. To make a global trade work, you need to move stuff. A lot of stuff. With the World Trade Organization estimating that in 2022 more than $25 trillion worth of merchandise was exported, with the UN report estimating the weight of that trade flow at 15 billion tons. And for all our inventions and technological developments, humanity still hasn't found a cheaper, more efficient way of moving most cargoes than putting them on a ship and floating them across a body of water. In part as a result of that, in 2022, more than 80% of international trade flows, about 12 billion tons, moved by sea. Now, in recent years, we got to see what happened when some of that transit got disrupted. In 2021, a container ship managed to run aground in the Suez Canal, blocking it for 6 days. The effect of that short blockage reverberated across global trade for months. And more recently, COVID caused disruptions all of its own. But moving into 2023, it started to look like things were going to calm down in terms of global shipping costs, with the UN Review of Maritime Transport observing that, quote, container shipping may have entered an overcapacity phase, end quote, meaning we were all due for lower shipping costs and downward pressure on inflation along with it. Of course, were is the operative word there, but we'll get back to that. If you want to visualize these immense flows that underpin the global economy, there's an image for you. Generated using marinetracker.com that gives you some idea of what tens of thousands of vessels driving maritime trade looks like. And as you can see, the flows aren't random or evenly distributed. They're often concentrated along certain popular routes, meaning that while there might be tracts of ocean that don't see a ship for years at a time, there are also vital arteries and choke points that might see numerous ships every single day. The Suez Canal in Egypt is one example of that sort of choke point. What the Suez Canal allows you to do is essentially to take a shortcut if you're travelling, for example, from Europe to Asia. If you're a container ship, for example, carrying goods from China to Europe, instead of taking the long trip around the southern tip of Africa, you can save something like 10 to 14 days on your average trip by cutting up through the Red Sea, crossing the Suez Canal, and ending up in the Mediterranean. Now, there's a lot of things that make the Suez Canal special. Firstly, it's an artificial phenomenon, a testament to the fact that shipping is so important that it's worth digging a ditch through a country in order to speed it up. During the days of the British Empire, the Brits considered it a vital strategic link, enabling Britain to be connected, for example, to oil from the Middle East or to India. And in part because the canal is so important, wars have been fought over it. We've talked, for example, about the Suez Crisis of 1956 before. Nowadays, however, the canal is operated by the Egyptian Suez Canal Authority. It's been considerably enlarged from its first iteration, meaning the canal can now accommodate just about every container ship out there. The vast majority of the bulk carriers are out there, and about 60% of the world's active tanker fleet. And according to the reports I found, about 12% of global trade, more than 20,000 ships per annum, flow through this canal. Each of those ships pays a fee. A safe average might be around $500,000 to make that transit, meaning there are a few more important economic enterprises in Egypt than the Suez Canal. All up, it sounds like a massive win for all involved. Egypt gets a much valued source of foreign currency, and international shippers, well, they get to save time, run their ships more often, and realise savings on things like fuel and overhead. The problem the world is now realising, however, is that to use the Suez Canal, you need to get to the Suez Canal. And while transit may not be a problem in the Mediterranean, travel further south and things get complicated. To the south of the canal is the Red Sea, and while it's never exactly wide by ocean-going standards, by the time you get to the south there, it's about as spacious as your average Tokyo student apartment. At the interface between the Red Sea to the north and Gulf of Aden in the south, there is a connecting strait that is only approximately 26 kilometres or about 16 miles wide. This is the Bab el-Mandeb, loosely translated as the Gates of Lamentation or Grief, which is absolutely the sort of name you want to hang on the door if your goal is to attract a significant proportion of global shipping. Moving tens of thousands of ships per annum through a strait like that is always going to make some of them vulnerable. The route is pretty predictable, spotting targets from shore is easy, room to manoeuvre evasively is more limited, and the range required on any anti-ship weapon to be effective is going to be much, much shorter. If you want to find and hit a target in the Pacific, for example, you might need top-tier satellite reconnaissance, an advanced kill chain, and very capable, very accurate, very responsive anti-shipping weapons. At the Gates of Grief, however, a couple of blokes, some binoculars and a few drones is probably going to cover your surveillance requirements, and while I'm not sure you reliably hit anything, there are legitimately artillery pieces that can fire from one side of the strait to the other. So if you're a global shipping company, you'd be hoping that a vital choke point like this one exists in a very safe, secure and stable geopolitical environment. What you obviously don't want is situations with weak economies or weak governments that allow pirates or paramilitaries to operate with impunity among civilian populations that don't have many economic opportunities. But of course, that would make global trade far too simple. And so instead, the Bab el-Mandeb is surrounded by such famously wealthy and stable countries as Eritrea, Yemen, and Somalia. Somalia has a GDP per capita of a couple of hundred US dollars per annum, about $2,000 in purchasing power parity terms. In the early 2010s, was famous for a number of regional exports, like piracy, and tops the global leaderboard in one specific category. Namely, that according to the Corruption Perception Index, there is no country on the planet more corrupt than Somalia. Countries like Zimbabwe, North Korea, Venezuela or Russia might try to compete, but in the end, Somalia took the gold in 2022. To the north, Eritrea is again a highly impoverished country with a GDP per capita of about $2,000 in purchasing power parity terms, and while it doesn't rank as highly on the Corruption Perception Index, only 162 out of 180 countries, Eritrea ranks near the bottom of the Freedom House Freedom Index, and hasn't had a legislative or presidential election since its independence in 1993. And despite having a population of fewer than 4 million people, maintains one of Africa's largest armies. The country's international relationships are complicated. The neighbouring country of Djibouti, however, with a population of just over 1 million people, has taken a very different approach to foreign engagement, by basically laying out a welcome mat and saying come in to anyone willing to pay. In a way that almost exploits its precarious security situation, Djibouti has turned military bases into one of its primary exports. The US, for example, back in 2014, signed a lease for a base in Djibouti that went for 10 years with an optional 10-year extension, with an annual lease price of $63 million US. Now, even before accounting for any secondary local stimulus from spending by the troops or purchases by the base, going off the 2019 estimates I have, that would make those annual lease payments about 9% of the country's annual government revenue. Not bad, but Djibouti clearly thought it could do better, because the country has also leased territory for Japan's only overseas military base, as well as bases or facilities for France, Italy, the UK and Germany, either through their own bases or shared and local facilities. Then in 2016, Djibouti allowed the People's Liberation Army of China to build a support base in the country. That meant more investment, another reportedly $20 million per annum, albeit at the cost of occasionally having to ask all sides to play nice. As Djibouti's foreign minister put it back in 2016, quote, "We are trying to keep the balance to see where our interest lies as a small country with very limited resources," end quote. As we'll see later, Djibouti is absolutely vital for anti-piracy operations in the region, and perhaps the only country in the area that has managed to turn the difficult security situation into an economic opportunity. But the key actor we need to talk about today is Yemen. And while I promised not to get too far into the history of the Houthi movement and the civil war in Yemen, for now it's enough to know the country isn't controlled by any one faction. Civil war broke out in 2014 with the Houthis taking over the capital city, and in the years that followed, much of the fighting, although it was multipolar, was between the Houthi movement, backed by Iran, and the internationally recognised government of the country, backed by, among others, Saudi Arabia. The Saudis and some of their regional allies intervened in the conflict militarily in 2015, largely using airstrikes. But as at time of recording, despite the conflict resulting in hundreds of thousands of deaths and leaving a majority of the population reliant on humanitarian aid, the actual lines of control are relatively static, and negotiations towards a ceasefire have continued. To a greater or lesser extent, the government or government-aligned forces are assessed to control the east and the southern coast of the country. The Houthis, by contrast, control the capital and many of the population centres in the country's northwest. Notably for the international community, the Houthis do not actually control the territory directly abutting the Bahr el-Mandeb. And if they did, the crisis we're about to go through would probably be far more acute. But they do control a stretch of coast to the west along the Red Sea, and numerous sites from which launching attacks is possible. Which brings us to the attacks themselves. Since the outbreak of the Israel-Hamas war, the Houthis have been very vocal in their opposition to Israel's military operations, and have arguably been much more proactive than other Iranian proxies like, for example, Hezbollah, in launching attacks against Israeli targets. Per some analysts, the reasons for that are probably a mixture of military and political. Political because the Houthis' domestic position is probably strengthened by being seen to launch attacks against Israel, and militarily because, compared to Hezbollah at least, the Houthis are probably much harder for Israel to effectively target. Hezbollah has to face off with Israeli ground forces and artillery units along the border between Israel and Lebanon, while the Houthis at most have to deal with long-range Israeli weapons like drones and airstrikes. And while the Israeli Air Force is obviously not a force that most opponents would readily write off, after years of dealing with Saudi airstrikes, the Houthis are probably kinda used to it. Initially, a lot of the attacks we see the Houthis launch are on targets in Israel itself. They fired a number of long-range missiles and drones at Israeli targets, to mixed effect. Trying to launch these attacks put the Houthis up against certain military limitations. Firstly, due to the ranges involved, only longer-range weapon systems could be used. And when they were used, they often encountered the issue of many Israeli targets having very good air and missile defences. Now, whatever purpose you might think the Houthi strikes on Israel have, they probably weren't intended to provide advertisements for Israeli air defense systems. And so in parallel with these attacks, and particularly more recently, we saw the Houthis switch their focus to a different target type, one that didn't have the benefit of living under a bubble of Iron Dome and Arrow systems. That target was merchant shipping in the adjacent Red Sea. Compared to targets in Israel, merchant ships were likely to be both less heavily defended and also targetable at much shorter ranges. It meant they were able to do things like become some of the world's first heli-borne pirates, where, in late November, a Houthi boarding team, using a helicopter, landed on a cargo ship in the Red Sea, hijacked it, sailed it to a port they controlled, and reportedly have been holding the crew captive ever since. And it was arguably this incident, along with a number of drone and missile attacks, that marked the progress of a very real change in Houthi targeting priorities. They were going to take their campaign to sea. Okay, so if that's the why, who were they shooting at and how? And surprisingly enough, when you're talking about shipping, who you're shooting at isn't really a simple question. When you're talking about a merchant ship, there are a lot of countries that might be protective of that vessel. Ships have a nation of registration, the country whose flag they fly, a country of ownership, a company or entity that actually manages and operates the vessel. Then there's a question of what country or countries the people on board are drawn from, and who has an interest in the cargo on board. If I had a Panamanian flag tanker owned by a Greek company with a crew recruited in the Philippines shipping oil from Saudi Arabia to India, for example, if somebody attacks that ship, are they attacking Panama, Greece, the Philippines, Saudi Arabia, or India? You can make an argument that to a greater or lesser extent, the answer is some degree of all of the above. The reporting on the Houthi stated targeting criteria has been somewhat vague, because they sometimes seem to imply they'll be very selective with their targeting, and other times not so much. They've reportedly said that they'll attack Israeli-owned ships, but in a 2022 UN report, Israel doesn't even appear on the list of top 35 owning nations for global merchant ships, meaning that by that measure and definition, if you threaten Israeli-owned ships, you're threatening at most a fraction of a percentage point of global capacity. It's also reported, however, that they said they might attack ships that are docking in Israel. That might include more vessels, but it's still a relatively small target set. Israel's three main ports handle less than 100 million tonnes of cargo per annum, and the global figure we saw earlier is north of 10 billion. So it would still probably be possible for the vast majority of global traffic to pass through safely. However, we've been given every indication that the targeting doesn't stop there. The head of Yemen's Supreme Revolutionary Committee, for example, is quoted as warning countries against, quote, falsifying their identity, end quote, including by raising flags different to that of the country of the ship owner. The problem with making a statement like that and still claiming that you're being careful in your targeting is that according to a UN report, about 70% of global tonnage is foreign flagged in exactly that way. So yeah, if you apply that standard, you can fire at the tiny fraction of a percentage of ships that are Israeli owned, the still relatively small collection that decide to dock in Israel, or, once you read the fine print at the bottom of the page, just about everyone. In practice, of course, apparent targeting decisions appear to have gotten messy, but there have been some patterns emerging. The Red Sea and the Straits absolutely aren't closed. Ships continue to use them and have continued to use them throughout the crisis. Russian, Iranian, and many other vessels have continued to move through the Red Sea and the Straits without feeling the need to request escort. Being at least somewhat differentiated in their targeting might allow the Houthis to achieve certain political objectives and to apply pressure. A country that is not currently being attacked, for example, might be pressured not to intervene or to reconsider its public position on the Israel-Hamas war because it's in their interest that their ships continue to make it through safely. But at the same time, the selective targeting clearly doesn't go that far because we've seen some odd targets selected, either because any claim linkage to Israel is very hard to find or may not even be present, or because of the location and optics involved. Recently, for example, there was a drone strike on the tanker MV Chem Pluto, about 200 miles off the Indian coast in the Arabian Sea. The ship was Liberian-flagged, Japanese-owned, Netherlands-operated, with a crew that included Vietnamese and Indian citizens that was engaged at the time in carrying oil from Saudi Arabia to India. I'd file a petition to rename the ship the MV Globalization, but I'm not sure it would go anywhere. The US has claimed this attack may have actually been the direct responsibility of Iran rather than the Houthis, and while it was reported the ship had some link to Israel, what that wasn't immediately apparent. So I went digging, and while this is in no way definitive, here's what I came up with. On Marine Tracker, the MV Pluto shows as owned and insured in Japan, but the manager of that ship is the Dutch firm Ace Quantum Chemical Tankers. Now, as at time of recording, if you go to the Ace Quantum website, their fleet list isn't published. But back in 2020 it was, and is archived. And while you won't find the Chem Pluto on that list, you will find ships with a very similar naming convention, like for example the Chem Venus. So operating on the assumption that that is the company in question, where's the Israeli link? And the answer reportedly might be that this operating company is a joint venture between Ace Tankers and Eastern Pacific Shipping, with the latter company being owned by an Israeli billionaire. Now it's very much not the same as Israeli ownership and a bit of a long bow to draw. In terms of degrees of separation, it'd be kind of like saying you don't like Daniel Ek, one of the co-founders of Spotify, and so to get at him, you're going to try and car bomb Tay Swift and Drake. Plus, as we'll see in a moment, the Indian government wasn't exactly thrilled with the idea of an oil tanker carrying cargo into its ports being attacked 200 miles off its coastline. To give just one more example, the Maersk Hangzhou, which was attacked recently, resulting in very limited damage to the vessel and the deaths of many of the Houthi attackers, was a South Korean-built, Singapore-flagged, Danish-owned and operated vessel. In terms of the how of these attacks, we've seen the Houthis use just about everything they have available to them. We've seen one-way attack drones, anti-ship ballistic missiles, anti-ship cruise missiles, helicopters landing teams, and also attacks that integrate more than one of these methodologies at the same time. And it's worth making a last-minute addition here about the attack on the Maersk Hangzhou. This attack in the closing days of December also gave us reportedly the first fatalities of the recent Houthi campaign. 4 small Houthi attack craft reportedly approached the ship and attempted to board her. In attempting to do so, the Houthis exchanged fire with a private security detail on board the container ship. US Navy helicopters responded to a call for assistance, and per some reports started issuing verbal warnings asking the Houthis to stop doing pirate things. The Houthis then reportedly did something that I would consider very stupid and fired on the helicopter, resulting in the near-inevitable sinking of 3 of the 4 vessels and the death of those aboard. In terms of threat profile, this is very different to the Somali pirates of old. Yes, you have these attempted boardings that might be fended off by private security or patrolling helicopters, but you also have the long-range attack element. It's an advanced, over-the-horizon, precision weapon threat. And it's one being launched by a force that, unlike pirates, doesn't necessarily need to capture a ship in order to count it as a win. Sometimes damage or sinking might be enough. And so without warship protection, even merchant ships that are carrying their own armed security guards, for example, will have no practical defense against them. And almost no matter how this now ends, I'd argue the impact on global shipping has already been extremely significant. I mean, let's be honest, you all knew this was going to become a question of defense economics or just regular plain old economics eventually. When you're talking about those economic costs, the one that we need to start with, and the one all of us probably feel and care about, is the cost of shipping. Anyone who has ever ordered something online will know that shipping, frankly, can be a bit of a bitch. For most things, shipping costs account for nowhere near a majority of the purchase price, but they still do drive and impact costs. And even if the thing you're consuming is produced locally and doesn't have to be transported that far, you might still see an increase in prices because the inputs might be transported. Farmer Joe might be selling locally grown produce at the farmer's market, but if he uses imported fertilizers or runs his equipment on imported fuel, then the increased cost of shipping those goods might leave you with a very expensive, locally grown tomato. In short, if you want to control inflation, you have to keep shipping available, reliable, and cheap. These sort of attacks, however, push shipping costs very much in the opposite direction. As a result of fears over these kind of attacks, hundreds of vessels have already diverted from taking the Red Sea-Suez route. Maritime tracking sites have allowed us to almost watch this phenomenon play out in real time, as some shipping firms make the decision that it's ultimately in their best interests to divert cargo south around Africa, even though that means expenses for delays, fuel, and overhead. Maersk imposed a transport disruption surcharge in December for diverted cargoes, and from the 1st of January, emergency contingency surcharges kick in on a wide variety of routes. One of the big drivers here is the cost of insurance. For my Millennial and Gen Z listeners, by the way, insurance is something bought by people who actually own things. Basically, every ship out there will have ordinary insurance, but war risk insurance is something extra, paid on top, usually as a percentage value of the vessel and its cargo when moving through specific regions. That's the coverage that actually helps you if you're hit by a cruise missile or run into a sea mine. And because the insurers seem to understand that you're much more likely to be hit by a drone or missile sailing off the coast of Yemen than you would be if you were doing laps of the Adriatic or something, the war risk premium, the price of that insurance, reflects the perceived danger of a given region. Per one report that I'll put in the description, back in early December, you could get war risk coverage for about 0.07% while taking that Red Sea-Suez route. Jump forward just a couple of weeks to the middle of December, and you are talking 0.5 to 0.7%. Now, if you're a shipper carrying relatively low-cost goods, perhaps paying the premium is still worth it in order to be able to use Suez and cut those valuable days off the trip. But if you're a container vessel carrying high-value goods like aviation engines, cars, or avocados, then nearly 1% vessel and cargo value in insurance can become millions of dollars very quickly. And at that point, it just makes good financial sense to divert the ship around Africa and avoid having to pay for the insurance. If you do divert, however, you're looking at a much longer trip, which means more costs and overheads, particularly when it comes to fuel. There I've seen estimates for some vessels of about $1 million extra per trip relative to taking the Suez route. And that's if the fuel is readily available in the first place. Ports in Africa may be congested due to the additional traffic, while vessels are also reportedly taking on greater fuel loads earlier at places like Singapore in order to account for the longer trips. Basically, the whole thing is one big domino effect, increased cost in one area, the war risk premium, and you force changes in behaviour which themselves drive increased costs. And unfortunately for all of us, I'm only getting started. Now I have to admit I'm a little bit biased in saying this, but from a logistical perspective, at least when they work, the transport schedules that might get goods delivered from halfway around the world all the way to your door can kind of be compared to glass sculptures. They are incredibly fragile, beautiful works of art. And so, when something like this happens, it hurts. Because a lot of people, working for a lot of different companies, don't have many other options than to brew some very strong coffee, scream loudly into the void, and then get to work, otherwise it's all about to fall apart. When you divert a ship and delay it for 10 or 14 days, that's not all you're doing. You're all but guaranteeing the cargo on that ship won't be in the next port when the next ship comes to pick it up, or the trains that are waiting to transport it arrive, which means all of those schedules need to be revisited. And if what you're talking about are inputs, say for example parts to go into a manufacturing process, you may be introducing other delays as well. A factory doesn't receive components, so it can't complete its vehicles, so the vehicles aren't ready to hit their assigned shipping date, and so those too have to be rapidly rescheduled. Rescheduling that might become all the harder because now there's the issue of shipping capacity. All else being equal, having ships take more time to make the journey from A to B is the same as having fewer vessels making the trip from A to B on the original route. That means all of a sudden there's less capacity in the system to make the originally planned deliveries. This is why even if you think you live in a country that isn't directly reliant on the Suez Canal, you might feel the results regardless. You might see fleets start to pull ships off completely unrelated routes in order to make up additional capacity. And with the sudden increase in competition for a scarce resource, namely shipping slots with particular arrival times to particular destinations, what you might start seeing are price spikes and spirals. Not just because of the general increase in cost for doing things like burning additional fuel, but rather as a result of the vicious fight between customers for the few remaining slots on the ships that will get their cargoes there in acceptable time. During COVID, we saw record profits for the shipping industry as customers tried to do all sorts of desperate things to deal with disruption. Customers intercepting shipments at ports partway through their planned journey and trucking them instead. Choosing more expensive or specialised freight options just because that was available. Diverting even heavy and bulky shipments to air freight, or begging carriers to staff their warehouses on weekends to keep shipments moving. Plus, if you really wanted your cargo on time, you might end up in a bidding war paying for priority. You put some big euros on the table, they reprioritise your shipment, and maybe it goes by air, maybe it goes on an earlier ship, but you still get it on time. In a sense, this is like people buying skip-the-line passes at Disneyland. Only instead of saving yourself some time in line, you're getting to go through the Panama Canal early or get your cargo on an earlier ship. The problem, of course, to stick with the theme park example, is the more people who buy these passes, the further back in the queue those who don't buy them are pushed, meaning there are greater and greater costs to not buying priority, meaning more people want to buy priority, which further punishes those who don't buy priority, which pushes more people to buy priority. Now, of course, I'm generalizing here, and this process can take a variety of forms. The Panama Canal auctions priority slots, which are expensive. Alternative shipping methods like air freight can get you there sooner, which is expensive. Or you might be looking at various other options with the same common theme. You pay to get there sooner. And the other ugly side to these sort of delay-induced costs is that they can take a long time to wash out of the system. Even if traffic through the Red Sea goes back to normal tomorrow, there will still have been an impact. Ships will still have been diverted. Uncertainty would still have been introduced. And it will probably take many months for all of those impacts to fully wash through the system. The Suez was blocked for just over 6 days in 2021, but it's probably fair to say that those 6 days arguably cost months, as firms steadily worked through the consequences of all those ships that were either diverted or left delayed. And what might all of that mean to you listening to at least some greater or lesser extent? Well, potentially return to some of 2022 and 2023's greatest hits. Stuff not arriving on time, and being more expensive when it does. And if powers want to avoid that issue, then the shipping companies need someone to come up with military assets to make sure that the fish of the Red Sea don't end up inhabiting an environment that is 90% sunken Teslas and iPhones. Fortunately for global merchant traffic, there are a lot of powers with significant navies that would like to see trade continue to pass through this region. So what we can talk about now are some of the steps those nations have taken to respond. The first thing to say here is it's not like there was no international military presence in the region before the Houthis decided to start slinging drones into the Red Sea. Long before the current Houthi anti-shipping threat, there was the Somali pirate threat. And so anti-piracy infrastructure and patrols in the region are actually relatively extensive. The Combined Maritime Forces, for example, is the world's largest multinational naval partnership, and it operates in exactly this region. Established in 2001, the CMF is headquartered in the Gulf, has 39 partner nations, including, it must be said, such unlikely partners as both Pakistan and India, and is made up of a number of combined task forces. Also in place was the Chinese 45th Escort Task Force out of Djibouti. That consists of a modern destroyer, modern frigate and support ship, representing a lot of capacity to undertake escort missions. The key point is that even before this kicked off, there was already a lot of warship in place. So of course, on the 18th of December, the US announced an entirely new operation intended to protect shipping in the Red Sea. I can only presume someone asked a Pentagon AI for the most stereotypical American escort operation name possible, and so it was announced as Operation Prosperity Guardian. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin announced that the coalition would include more than 20 members, although about half of them were secret, and we subsequently found out that many of the vessels in the operation would come under the control of Combined Task Force 153, that we just discussed before. Now, in terms of response, Prosperity Guardian got some pretty mixed reactions. Some of the responses were fairly dramatic. It's reported, for example, that a top Houthi official said of the operation, quote, "The Red Sea will be your graveyard," end quote. But for a lot of the other parties involved, the response just seemed a little more sedate. That was especially the case once it became clear that some of the countries named as participants wouldn't exactly be sending the armada. A lot was made in the days following the announcement of Prosperity Guardian that the whole operation seemed a little bit undercooked. The number of countries involved, for example, was significantly less than the number that contributed to the combined maritime forces. But as we go through a list of countries and how they're responding to the crisis, hopefully it'll become apparent that focusing too tightly on Prosperity Guardian might be missing the broader picture. Greece was pretty quick to come out and say they would send a frigate to participate in Prosperity Guardian. Perhaps unsurprising, given that Greek owners reportedly hold about 5,000 merchant ships, accounting for about 17% of global carrying capacity. The only country with a larger ownership share is the People's Republic of China, and then only if you count their main national register and the separate Hong Kong ship register as one individual entry. Next on the list, the French were announced as participants in Prosperity Guardian, but later clarified that they wouldn't be placing any ships under US command. What they did do, however, was, using a very capable FREM-type frigate, get into the region and start escorting French-owned or flagged vessels. The French had already shot down their first 2 incoming drones on December 9th, and as at time of recording have escorted a number of vessels over the course of December. It's at this point you can see why arguing about what ships are or are not involved in Prosperity Guardian might be a distinction without a difference. If there is a warship on station, escorting merchantmen and shooting down incoming, I doubt the Houthis much care what administrative structure controls it. And so I think the focus should probably be on who is sending ships as opposed to who is in what operation. Italy isn't in Prosperity Guardian, but they are sending a FREM to, quote, "counter the destabilising terror activity of the Houthis, which we have already publicly condemned, and protect the prosperity of trade and guarantee freedom of navigation and international law." Another contribution, which has recently been clarified, is that of Denmark. This is a nation that is actually home to one of the world's largest shipping companies. And while small, the Danish Navy does have a number of modern, capable warships. And as at time of recording, it's just been reported that in January, the Danes will be sending one of their frigates to support Prosperity Guardian, which may not sound like much in absolute terms, but as a proportion of their overall fleet, is a significant commitment. They also stand out in, like the UK and Greece, being willing to operate within the American framework. Now, if you want to talk about some of the interested non-European actors, Egypt was very clear that it didn't want to participate in Prosperity Guardian. But Egypt has every interest in traffic continuing through the Suez Canal, and a number of Egyptian Navy warships are active in the Red Sea. And then there's India, another non-participant in Prosperity Guardian, but which responded very negatively to the attack on the MV Chem Pluto, which was, remember, carrying a cargo into India, with Defence Minister Singh reported as saying that the nation would find those responsible for the attacks and take action. India's ramped up patrol and deterrence efforts, deploying both surface warships and aircraft. And if one of those warships on its patrols happens to detect, for example, a one-way attack drone, I'll leave it to you in the audience to guess just how eager the captains on that vessels might be to fire off a missile and put those drones in the water. The point is that there is a lot of warship tonnage in or on its way to the Red and Arabian Seas. And given that one of the ships is a supercarrier, also a lot of firepower. Now, of course, there are still a huge range of questions about all of this that are probably only going to be clear in the coming months. For example, it's still unclear to me what role, if any, China's 45th Escort Group, based out of Djibouti, will have in escorting ships that might come under potential Houthi attack. These are warships that on paper are very capable of dealing with missile and drone threats, so they are suitable for the mission, but it remains to be seen how the Chinese government will ultimately choose to task them. Another unanswered question, and quite possibly the multi-billion-dollar one, is whether it will work. Here, the big measure of success will be whether the naval operations are sufficient to convince the major shipping companies to resume normal traffic through the Red Sea and Suez. So far, the results have been mixed and are still very much up in the air. At one extreme, Maersk is reportedly planning to sail basically all of their relevant container vessels through the Suez route in January. And France's CMA CGM has also announced that they'll be increasing the number of vessels moving through the Suez route. Other companies, like the German and Japanese giants, are reportedly planning to continue diverting vessels, taking the trip around Africa rather than risk the Red Sea. I say this is all up in the air though because these decisions can change rapidly. Hapag-Lloyd has said their next assessment on the situation and the need for continuing diversions will be made on the 2nd of January. Meanwhile, Maersk, who we just talked about as a party wanting to send their ships through the Red Sea route, reportedly put a 48-hour hold on those transits after the attack on the Hangzhou. So the sort of disruptions we see in early 2024 might owe a lot to how confidence in the escort operation is built literally day by day. But again, there's a relevant cost and sustainability element here. And this is the resource investment required to protect ships travelling through dangerous routes. Because while we're still seeing ships choose to travel through this region, many of them are only going to choose to do so with the presence of adequate military protection. And that kind of protection costs money. Now, as a brief historical aside, to a great extent, the responsibility for protecting merchant traffic used to sit with the country the ships were flagged to. And you could say this created a sort of give and take relationship between the merchant ship and the country they were flagged to. Before World War II, for example, about a third of the world's merchant ships flew British colours. On the downside, that meant costs and liability to be conscripted to support the British war effort in times of war. But on the plus side, it meant if anyone tried to mess with you, you had the protection of the Royal Navy. And in the early 20th century, that was kind of like being able to tag in a professional MMA fighter every time you got into a schoolyard brawl. After World War II, however, we see the emergence of what are called open registries. These are locations like Panama, Liberia, or the Marshall Islands that allow foreign vessels to register and pay a small fee in order to fly their colours. According to the United Nations, in deadweight tonnage terms back in 2022, 44% of global capacity was flagged either to Panama, Liberia, or the Marshall Islands. Other commonly used flags included Malta at 5.2%, the Bahamas at 3.3%, Cyprus at 1.5%, with even the mighty Isle of Man managing 291 registered vessels, amounting to 1% of global deadweight tonnage capacity. Now, on the plus side for global trade, this brought shipping costs down significantly. You had cost competition between registries, few obligations on registered merchant ships, and so shipping costs in the system as a whole were probably lowered as a result. The problem, however, from a security perspective, is that while Panama and Liberia might offer you very cheap options to register a ship, if you get into trouble, good luck calling for help from the mighty Liberian battle fleet. Now, of course, as a ship owner or shipping company, you might decide to rely on national governments deciding to step in anyway, even if you aren't flagged to their country. A lot of countries have a keen interest in keeping trade flowing, and the US Navy is very clear about the fact that it supports freedom of navigation. That said, as we've arguably seen over the last couple of weeks, in a crisis, countries might choose to prioritise the protection of vessels that are owned by or registered to their country or their allies. The French frigate was heavily involved in escorting French ships. And US Navy protection for US flagged vessels carrying Department of Defense cargoes is obviously much more of a given than them rolling up to provide backup to a truly neutral vessel. But arguably, that's all more a question of distributing risk and cost than it is of the cost itself. And trust me, those can be pretty significant. To start with, there's just the base cost of keeping a ship and its crew deployed. You want to keep a US supercarrier and its air wing operational, for example, be ready to cough up 10 figures per annum. Look at something much smaller like the US's next generation frigates, and the CBO estimates their direct cost for operations and support at about $63 million per annum. But those are basically just the costs for keeping the warship in situ and looking scary to those in the vicinity. If you want the ship to actually shoot at things, well, you need to open your wallet again. In mid-December, the USS Carney reportedly shot down 14 drones that had been launched from Yemen. Those drones may have cost thousands or tens of thousands of dollars per unit. But given the ranges involved, and according to some reporting, Carney almost certainly used standard missiles to bring them down. Missiles like SM-2 are very capable, very accurate, and very expensive. Meaning I would be very surprised if the actual cost of shooting down those 14 drones was less than $24 million. Basically, the shot exchange problem we've become so familiar with in Ukraine doesn't go away just because you're now talking about naval warfare. In fact, if anything, the problem might be getting worse over time. We've seen navies adopting more and more capable and more expensive interceptor missiles to deal with new threats. Increasingly advanced anti-shipping missiles, or potentially hypersonics for example, demand more capable interceptors. SM-6 as a result delivers a lot of capability that SM-2 doesn't have, but at a significantly greater cost. Drones, meanwhile, can stay cheap or get even cheaper. And as production scales in a number of countries around the world, the threat's not going away. So even if the various ships deployed to the region have the capability to shoot down incoming missiles and drones, which they obviously do given they've shot down a bunch of them, there's still, I think, an open question around just how sustainable the approach is. Sending in advanced warships to shoot down drones using missiles obviously works, but at the same time probably causes taxpayers half a world away to experience spontaneous, unexplainable headaches. For now, flooding the Red Sea with warships might be the approach. But given attackers don't even actually have to sink anything in order to successfully drive up costs or disrupt trade, plus the massive costs of sustaining these sort of deployments and engagements, you can see why actors involved might be looking for some sort of alternative. Because so far, despite 100% of those killed being Houthis and no ships being sunk, the costs are very real. So if the imbalance between the cost and effect for the attackers and defenders is so great, what are some of the escalation options that might be available to the convoying powers to try and redress the balance a little? And here, just for the sake of illustration, we'll stay focused on the Red Sea with the Houthis as the attacking power and the various other countries we've discussed as the convoy defenders. One option I've seen discussed is reflagging merchant vessels with a US or allied flag. This obviously doesn't do anything in a direct military sense. The Stars and Stripes don't have magical powers to repel incoming missiles. But what it might do is give reflag vessels the magical spell Summon US Navy. This was done on admittedly a relatively small scale during the 1980s during the so-called Tanker War. In 1987, the Kuwaiti government requested the US Navy provide escort to Kuwaiti tankers carrying Iraqi oil to the international market. In order to frame the legal and political framework for that escort operation and to signal to Iran that there might be consequences if the attack continued, a number of Kuwaiti oil tankers were reflagged as American oil tankers and subsequently placed under escort. It's worth noting that there's a major obstacle to reflagging in this situation, namely the sheer number of vessels that use the Suez. But given the historical precedent and just how often it comes up in discussions, I thought I should mention it. So let's take a step up the escalation ladder and ask, what do you do if signalling a deterrence doesn't work? What do you do, for example, if a US flagship is hit in the Red Sea? Or we see something like we did back in the October of 1987, where the Iranians decided to F around by hitting a re-flagged US tanker, Sea Isle City, with an anti-ship missile, injuring multiple members of the crew. Well, then you might move to something resembling the find out stage, where the defending forces start striking back directly. In 1987, that took the form of Operation Nimble Archer, where the United States Navy retaliated for the attack on the tanker by targeting two non-producing Iranian oil rigs that were being used by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. Meanwhile, in the current environment, that might mean air and missile strikes against Houthi military targets, with the most obvious targets being things like missile launchers, radar systems, or anything facilitating the attacks. We've already talked about the fact the US has an aircraft carrier in the region, as well as surface warships and a submarine capable of carrying cruise missiles, which is a capability, it has to be stressed, that many of the other nations involved also have. As a general principle, striking back might seem attractive from a military perspective. Fighting only on the defensive is inevitably going to be expensive and also result in at least some attacks probably getting through. The cost to the attacking force is always going to be limited just to the ordnance that they choose to fire. Meanwhile, if you give the defending force permission to strike back, then the potential attacker losses after any given operation broaden to anything that can feasibly be hit by a cruise missile or carrier aviation, which is, when you're talking about Yemen, basically everything. There are, however, a couple of reasons to be cautious with saying that simply bombing the Houthis might solve the defenders' problem in this case, namely that the Houthi-controlled parts of Yemen are probably pretty resistant to bombing efforts. Remember, this is a group which endured more than half a decade of largely aerial bombardment by the Saudi Arabians and several of their allies. In terms of equipment and technical capabilities, the Saudi Air Force is no slouch, with plenty of modern American platforms and a large supply of precision-guided munitions. But while some countries might be full of valuable military targets that you could hold at risk in order to provide deterrence, think things like large military manufacturing facilities, arms depots, headquarters, or major military bases. Houthi-controlled Yemen, by contrast, as a bombing target, is equal parts Ukraine and Afghanistan. Like Ukraine in the sense that a lot of the finances and the military-industrial supply chain that supports its activities don't actually reside within the country itself, but rather allied countries that cannot be attacked, in this case Iran. And like Afghanistan in the sense that the Houthis have become very good at dispersing, burying, or concealing their arms depots and launch sites. With light and mobile weapons, like drones or anti-ship missiles, any small stretch of open territory can be a launch site. And even if every single arms depot in the country is destroyed by some sort of coalition bombardment, attacks might still continue as long as new weapons are able to flow in from Iran. This is the problem we've talked about before of trying to fight a force that is receiving active resupply from a foreign power. This is a problem the Americans tried to solve in Vietnam and failed, a problem the Soviets tried to solve in Afghanistan, failing, a problem the Russians are trying to solve in Ukraine, so far to no success, and which the Saudis attempted to solve in this exact place, fighting this exact opponent, with them too failing. That isn't to say, of course, that we won't see American or coalition airstrikes of some kind. But at this stage, it seems more likely that they would be relatively limited, aimed at specific infrastructure or targets and intended to provide signalling, deterrence, or even just impose a limited degree of cost for ongoing attacks, as opposed to permanently crippling the military capacity of the Houthis. That almost certainly isn't a problem that a couple of guided bombs or cruise missiles can solve. Hypothetically, of course, there might be military means to resolve that problem, either deploying boots on the ground in Yemen or going after Yemen's supply chain from Iran. But for what I hope are obvious reasons, both of those ideas are likely to be non-starters in the current environment. Somehow I doubt the prospect of another land war in the Middle East would poll particularly well with the American public, while strikes on Iran directly would raise the spectre of massive escalation risk. And so while it's hypothetically possible that someone decides to send in the Marines like it's the shores of Tripoli in 1804, I'd probably favour pressing X to doubt. So in the present Red Sea situation, there might be military escalation options, but none are perfect or without significant drawbacks. And that's before you start taking into account things like politics and diplomacy. For example, countries like Egypt and the members of the European Union have every interest in keeping shipping travelling through Suez. But for domestic political reasons, they might have every motivation not to do anything that could be interpreted as unequivocally supporting Israel in the current war. Even though what the Houthis are doing is impacting global trade flows, they publicly describe what they're doing in terms of opposing Israel's operations in Gaza. And so from that perspective, running passive defensive ships against incoming ordnance might be one thing, but publicly aligning with a US-led operation or launching strikes against Yemen itself, that would be entirely another. Then you could run through a laundry list of other concerns. Countries might be worried that active participation would lead to their ships being attacked more often. There might be concerns, as per one article I'll link in the description, that attacks on Yemen might actually strengthen the domestic political position of the Houthis. Because, as we've gone over before, sometimes being bombed actually increases domestic political cohesion. Add to that concerns around torpedoing ceasefire negotiations between the Houthis and Saudi Arabia, potentially prompting more direct involvement from Iran or its various proxies in the region, or just undermining some of the cohesion between the various allied actors. And you can probably understand why, in an environment where their warships haven't been attacked directly, countries like the US are not yet launching attacks against Yemen directly or choosing to escalate in a major way. Whether they choose to do so in the future is obviously an open question with a lot of calculus going into it. But I will close out this section with a note that seems to have been forgotten in some of the reporting on this issue. Namely that the US already launched airstrikes against Houthi targets in Yemen back in 2016. At the time, in response to attempted missile attacks against the USS Mason and other ships in the Red Sea, the US launched cruise missile strikes against a number of radar sites on Yemen's Red Sea coast. Under the heading, Defending Freedom of Navigation, the US Central Command described the strikes as follows, quote, "These targets were chosen based on our assessment that they were involved in missile launches in recent days, and they were struck in order to defend our ships and their crews, and so protect freedom of navigation through a waterway that is vitally important to international commerce." Quote. Now obviously the regional context in 2016 was very different from that in 2023, but I still think it illustrates a potential precedent. Back in 2016, someone tried to touch one of Uncle Sam's ships, and so they issued a protest in Tomahawk form. Whether something similar occurs at some point in 2024, only time will tell. But the point I want to get to, and one of the terrifying potential lessons of all of this, is that the problem we are currently seeing as a result of relatively small-scale attacks in the Red Sea could potentially apply at a significantly greater scale to all sorts of maritime choke points around the world, leaving many actors, even those with relatively humble resources, with the ability to hold a gun to the head of the global economy. What you're looking at here is another image from marinetracker.com that I've cleaned up so you're only looking at things like tankers, bulk carriers, and container ships. Something I've done on the assumption that the global economy probably doesn't care where the billionaire yachts are sailing at any given time, as long as the ships carrying food, fuel, and fast fashion continue to arrive on schedule. And what you'll see looking at that map is that while there is a lot of ocean out there are multiple places around the world where traffic can get very congested and shoved into particular choke points. And those, just like the gates of grief, are potential points of vulnerability. If you're talking about global energy flows, for example, a lot of that is going to come out of the Persian Gulf through the Straits of Hormuz. This includes oil from such minor suppliers as Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE, as well as shipments of things like liquefied natural gas from Qatar that have become so essential to the European energy supply. And so you have a constant flow of slow-moving tankers carrying very flammable or explosive cargoes through a strait right off the Iranian coast that, frankly, it feels like someone threatens to close every second week. About a fifth of the world's oil passes through this choke point, and there's far more potential firepower pointed at it than there is at the Bar el Mandeb. In 2016, that meant 18.5 million barrels of oil per day moving through those straits. And if you start talking about suddenly taking those sort of volumes off the oil market, well, you might see lines going up like it's GameStop January 2021. But the Middle East doesn't have a monopoly on maritime choke points. One of the busiest in the world is the Malacca Straits. If you want the shortest route west from Asia, you're going to travel through this strait bordering Singapore, Malaysia, and Indonesia. And if you do want to divert around it for whatever reason without traveling in completely the opposite direction, you're still going to have to thread the needle between different Indonesian islands. These routes are the lifelines for many Asian economies. Whether that means energy resources coming in from the Middle East, exported goods travelling out to markets in places like Europe, or the long line of bulk carriers carrying Australian resources into the Asian market. If these flows were ever choked, economies are going to feel it. Zoom in closer on China and you might argue the issues run deeper. Many shipping flows run through the so-called First Island chain, west or east of the island Taiwan, in between various islands controlled by the nation of Japan, or between Japan and Korea. During peacetime, this is arguably excellent for trade. There's lots of short routes and plenty of supporting infrastructure. Operating along these routes, you will never be short of places to refuel or container ports to take on or put off cargo. But if things were to ever get a little bit tense and you were to start imagining long-range anti-ship missile batteries in places like Korea or on Okinawa, then you might start to get a little bit more nervous about shipping companies making their delivery dates. But geographically speaking, there are very few countries that get to be exempt from this problem. We don't tend to think about maritime choke points in Europe so much because of the post-1991 security situation, but they still exist. If you're a large vessel, you get into the Mediterranean Sea through one of three choke points: the Bosphorus Strait from the Black Sea, the Suez Canal from the Red Sea, or you cross in from the Atlantic going through the Straits of Gibraltar, which helps explain from a historical perspective why in the south of Spain there is a giant rock that is still sovereign British territory. Because when you're a major military power, you want it to be your guns overlooking a vital maritime choke point. Meanwhile, if and when Sweden formally joins NATO, member nations will basically have a lock on entry into the Baltic, which is probably something Russian planners, much like the Soviets before them, are very much aware of. And a scary thing to note here is that sometimes you can have issues with these choke points even if there's no hostile action taking place. The Panama Canal, for example, is a very famous maritime choke point that allows ships to take a shortcut between the Atlantic and the Pacific, because the French and later Americans decided it would be really convenient if you didn't have to go around the south coast of South America to do things like link the US east and west coasts, and so they basically decided to build an artificial water elevator system at the narrowest part of the continent. At the moment, however, capacity through the Panama Canal is tightly limited. Ships are reportedly paying up to $4 million to skip the queue to go through. And the reason transit is restricted isn't any action by the Panamanian government or threats by foreign military powers, it's just a drought. Ships need water in order to do ship things, and so if there isn't enough water to feed the canal, the ships can't ship. And one of the reasons the disruptions in the Red Sea are as significant as they are is because many ships had already been diverted to taking that route because Panama is so difficult to get through. The point here is that despite the Earth's surface being mostly ocean, geography and human engineering has done a pretty good job of forcing a lot of global trade through some narrow funnels. And the potential present and future threat to those funnels is, I'd argue, very real. And in large part, this is because the old sword and shield problem, the race between the attack and the defense, doesn't really apply in the same way to trade protection as it does to military-on-military engagements. When we talked about hypersonic missiles or anti-ship missiles in the past, for example, we talked about some of the defensive technologies that are evolving to counter them. Warships with better sensors, next-generation electronic warfare, or advanced missile interceptors, all of which came together to suggest that even though the sword was getting ever sharper, the shield might be getting thicker at the same time. But here's the thing. Civilian shipping targets don't get those defensive upgrades. No one is taking next-generation LNG tankers and strapping an Aegis system and a couple of VLS cells to it in order to keep up with offensive threats. Offensive weapons like missiles and drones, along with the sensors and communication technology that enable countries to form kill chains against moving targets, get better and better, But the defensive capacity of civilian vessels doesn't just stay static historically, in some cases it's arguably gone backwards. Let's illustrate the point. Think about the Battle of the Atlantic during World War II, where the Germans were trying to interdict trade between the US and Britain. In order to do that, first you have to find the merchant ships in the Atlantic, which means long-range air patrols by things like Condor aircraft. And then realistically, to achieve any significant sinkings, you need to task a submarine to intercept that convoy, and then risk a valuable submarine and its crew to launch the attack. If you manage to destroy some of the merchantmen, congratulations, you've probably sunk something like a US Liberty ship. Those things might have cost a couple of $1 million in their near term, so tens of millions of dollars in 2023, and have the capacity to carry maybe 10,000 deadweight tons of cargo. There might be a few dozen crew members on board to do damage control if the ship was only lightly damaged, and if you did sink it, congratulations, America's going to turn out 4 more by lunchtime the next day. Cut forward to 2023, however, and the calculus looks very different. During peacetime, if I want to track a ship, often I can do it online. But even if it goes dark, this is an era of satellite reconnaissance, advanced radars, surveillance drones, and an era of communication technologies that mean I can put people out on small vessels like trawlers, and they can call in and transmit identifications basically instantly. I probably no longer have to task a manned asset against a target. I might have long-range anti-ship missiles, ballistic missiles, one-way attack drones, and a variety of other systems. Meanwhile, the ship I am hitting might be far, far more valuable than the Liberty ships of old. An Edinburgh-class container ship built by Hyundai Heavy Industries, for example, isn't rated for 10,000 deadweight tons, but for 140,000. Counted in 20-foot container equivalents, that's 13,000 TEUs. Hit something like that, and you're looking at, among other things, a nightmarish fire hazard, as whatever is packed in those thousands and thousands of containers potentially catches fire, and damage control has to be handled by a crew of 13. In the absence of a military escort, therefore, ships are potentially more valuable and easier to hit than ever before. And because of just how valuable they are, even a threat with a relatively low percentage chance of sinking, destroying, or severely damaging them might be enough to drive insurance premiums so intolerable they wouldn't look out of place in the US healthcare system. Again, while there's been one successful hijacking, the Houthis haven't actually sunk anything. They haven't even reportedly inflicted particularly severe damage. But if a war risk premium of less than 1% is enough to get shipping companies diverting cargo, then logically speaking, if you assume insurance companies are not charities, if you can achieve a probability of kill against ships moving through a target area of even just a few percent, then you're going to see a war risk premium of, at minimum, that percentage plus a profit margin plus coverage for damage, and the whole disruption and diversion train wreck might start playing out. And there's plenty of reasons to think that, frankly, the situation is going to get worse before it gets better. Because whereas during the Cold War, long-range deadly anti-ship weapons like anti-ship missiles were largely the tools of major powers, cut forward to 2023, and there are probably more barriers to entry for a basic job at Macca's than there are for a nation looking to get into the anti-shipping game. Advanced weapons like Onyx or the Naval Strike Missile obviously help, but as Ukraine has arguably showed on a number of occasions, you can make life hard for an actual navy using pretty ad hoc weapons. Yes, there are things like Neptune and Storm Shadow, but Russia has also suffered damage from things like largely homemade kamikaze surface drones. And at the point where you can hit things with a kamikaze air or naval drone, your cost and risk of engagement go from anyone who can afford anti-shipping missiles, radars to locate vessels, and the command and control systems to effectively engage them, to anyone who can use the internet, operate a remote control, buy a jet ski, and source something sufficiently explosive to put on it. And unlike other traditional very low-tech threats, like piracy using small skiffs or suicide boats for example, these options are much harder to defend against. A few armed security guards on board a container ship might be enough to deter a pirate attack. But I don't care how many combat tours those security guards had before they went private. Even if you have the blingiest AR-15 platform on the market, you are not gunning down incoming anti-ship missiles. The threat requires new defenses that merchant ships simply don't have. So let me close out 2023 on the happy note of illustrating why all of this matters, and why it might matter to you whether you live in a country directly reliant on the Suez Canal or not. Hypothetically, technology and capabilities that can be used to target ships in one area could also be used elsewhere. A lot of the technologies and techniques used by the Ukrainians and Houthis are literally rocket science, but others aren't. Over time, those technologies and techniques will probably proliferate, until they're potentially applicable to more and more maritime security environments. To illustrate what I'm talking about, there are plenty of drones active in Ukraine now that can launch attacks at ranges beyond 500 kilometers. And I've thrown up a map here showing you what a 500-kilometre diameter circle looks like in the Mediterranean, or over a busy maritime choke point. Low-profile surface drones with those sort of ranges are also very much on the cards. I say this not to say that the Mediterranean is under any imminent threat of these sort of attacks, but rather to illustrate that once these technologies become available, there are a lot of locations we don't traditionally think of being at risk that probably become more and more accessible to any party with access to what are, in military terms, relatively basic and accessible technology. That's warning point 1. Warning point 2, I think, is just how fragile some of these routes are proving to be and what that might mean for war and contingency planning. So far, the Houthis have not managed to sink a single ship. And yet, despite launching very cheap attacks in monetary terms and doing relatively little human and physical damage, they have been able to cause major shipping lines to divert traffic, take on millions of dollars in additional costs, and cause some shipping companies to basically throw up their hands and say, no, sorry, that's too risky for us. So if that's all it takes, I have to ask, what happens to shipping flows during a potential conflict between major peer or near-peer opponents? What happens to one or more of the parties involved in a confrontation if the other invests a few resources or a lot of resources in telling global shipping firms that that's a lovely tanker they have there and it would be a shame if something happened to it? And that's a concern I suspect that war planners are going to have to keep a close eye on. We've already talked about the vulnerability of supply chains to Europe, for example, so let's pivot around and talk about a country in Asia. We've talked about China's expanding military capabilities before, its heavy investment in things like hypersonic weapons and anti-ship ballistic missiles that enable it to a greater and greater extent to hold at risk shipping further and further away from its shores. But while you may be able to zone out an enemy fleet with hypersonic missiles, you can't escort your merchant ships with them. And so Chinese planners might have to grapple with the idea that even if they can secure superiority somewhere like the Taiwan Strait, to pick one random example, one suspects there might be major concerns if maritime trade flows in and out of the country were for some reason interrupted. China is a major exporter, but it's also a significant importer. The country reportedly consumes, for example, about 16 million barrels of oil per day, of which 12 million has to be imported. About half of that comes by sea from the Middle East. And while you might be able to bring in oil through alternative routes, like pipelines from Russia, those routes are ultimately limited. Now, of course, there are ways you can counter those sort of vulnerabilities. China, for example, has built up a strategic oil reserve that might be good to cover more than 100 days of peacetime imports. But no storage is infinite, and oil is just one good. China imports hundreds of billions of dollars worth of machinery and equipment, fuel, ores, vehicles, relevant materials like copper, and food. At the same time, a significant share of the country's economy is key to exports, the vast majority of which go out by ship. So if the PRC was ever to find itself confronting a nation with the will and capacity to put the squeeze on global shipping into or out of China, there are, as with most nations, a lot of pain points here. And the only reason I'm using China as an example here is to illustrate that even military superpowers may face serious vulnerabilities if their maritime supply chains are ever threatened. Moving away from a high-end state actor type threat back to something more like the Houthis, I suspect there may also be a point here about navies needing the right ship for this sort of job. In particular, nations might want to have ships that are capable enough to defend against these sort of current and future projected threats, but aren't so over-engineered or expensive that they aren't available in sufficient numbers. The US Navy, for example, has its LCS, the Littoral Combat Ships, which I will absolutely pick on someday in 2024. These ships, when they're working, have some very good traits. They're very, very fast. They have decent sensors. Some of them have significant aviation facilities, and they have smaller crews than larger warships. So something like that is probably going to be decent if your mission is, for example, hunting down pirates on skiffs. You've got the speed to catch them, and the armament on board is going to be entirely sufficient. But one of the things that neither the Freedom or the Independence class ships have is any sort of onboard VLS system that can support longer-range anti-air missiles. That means that while an LCS might be capable of defending itself against something like an incoming one-way attack drone using CWIS or a short-range rolling airframe missile, it's not going to have the longer-range weapons it needs to defend something like a sprawling convoy against incoming threats, or to shoot down higher-end targets like anti-ship ballistic missiles. At the same time, if all you have available are high-end surface combatants spec'd primarily for peer-on-peer engagements, then you might just not have enough vessels available for escort operations. The US Arleigh Burke-class destroyers, for example, are doing excellent work bringing down incoming in the Red Sea. And based on recent reports, I think it is an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, the USS Carney, that's currently at the top of the leaderboard in terms of number of drones downed. But you have to wonder if in some threat environments, a slightly cheaper but still appropriately equipped frigate or corvette might be able to do some of the destroyer's work instead, freeing up those higher end warships for other duties, like protecting carriers or deploying to the Pacific. Point 4 is that given just how expensive and resource intensive things like convoy defense against even relatively accessible threats is, there probably has to be a broader deterrence and diplomacy piece here. No navy, not even the US Navy, can afford to run passive defense for all of the world's merchant ships that might run through vaguely threatened environments. And so you'd suspect that there's a lot of incentive to make sure that just because countries have the capacity to attack these sea lines of communication, they ultimately decide not to. Whether that's because they are deterred by the threat of military, economic, diplomatic, or political consequences, or because it's ultimately not in their interest because they too benefit from international investment and freedom of the seas, well, that's probably beyond the scope of this video. What matters is that ultimately most nations and non-state actors don't decide to start throwing rocks in this glass house we all live in, because in the end, there are only so many rocks global navies can catch, especially when making those catches might mean firing off a salvo of SM-2s. Because to end this year on a happy note, I think the trend is towards the threat getting greater and the system becoming more fragile. In a sense, the world might be on the clock before more and more actors have greater and greater capacity to strike at global trade flows in a way that is cheaper, more accurate, and more accessible than ever before. It's not a threat that's likely to be limited to any one particular country, and while the war in Ukraine has arguably showed that sometimes transit through high-risk environments is possible, one expects those transits won't always come without effort or risk. So only time will tell how well and how quickly countries are able to prepare for these sort of threats, and how robust global trade will be the first time it's subjected to a threat greater than the budget arsenal of a non-state actor, or a single ship wedged in a canal. In conclusion, the crisis in the Red Sea is probably far from over. Houthi attacks have continued, as have shipping diversions, and the recent deployment of lethal force by US helicopters does mark something of an escalation. But however the crisis evolves and what assets it's sent to the region, it's probably already served as a warning of sorts, a reminder that trade flows can be fragile, and that unless they're properly protected, countries around the world may feel the impacts. And okay, here is a channel update to close out. Firstly, Happy New Year, and apologies for this one releasing a day late. Ultimately, as we were approaching New Year's Eve, I made the decision that I wanted to take a little bit of pressure off people like my sound guy by just, for once, pushing a release back a single day. Don't worry, I'm not aiming to make it a habit, and it did mean I was able to bring in the news of US and Houthi forces exchanging fire with one another. I'll save my reflections on the channel in 2023 for next week, but for the moment, once more, let me just wish you a very happy new year, and express my hope that it's a little bit shorter on international conflicts and crises than 2022 or 2023 were. My thanks and best wishes to all of you, and I'll see you again later this week.